For updates on that situation, I want to welcome on Caleb Heimlich, the chairman of the Washington State Republican Party. Caleb, when we look at what's going on in Seattle, it's hard to compare it to anything else. I mean, it's a rather bizarre situation. What should city officials be doing in responding to this situation? And for everyone that doesn't know, it's about a 6-block radius where these protesters are claiming an autonomous zone that is free of America. What should the Republicans in that state be doing to respond to that situation?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, as the president has pointed out, this is a abject failure of political leadership by the mayor of Seattle, Jenny Durkan, and by our governor, Jay Inslee. This has been going on for about a week, started Monday of last week when the mayor ordered the police chief to abandon a precinct. This was a law enforcement office where they served the surrounding community. They loaded up boxes of evidence, took photos off the wall, and just left and abandoned that precinct. I think, as you can imagine, that's going to be devastating to morale as a police officer who's been protecting the community. The police chief has said response times to emergency calls have tripled in that area. So it's going to take a long time for an emergency responder to get to an emergency, which is unsustainable. It's untenable. And so clearly, we need elected officials, in this case a governor and a mayor, that are willing to enforce the rule of law, that are willing to protect property and allow the police to do their job.
And I think when we look at that, too, it's worth mentioning that the mayor and the police commissioner are on two entirely separate pages. I mean, even the information that they're putting out every single day are very different. One says that there's armed individuals, that there's some violence taking place, and the mayor was calling it summer of love, I believe is the phrase that she used, which is, I mean, the difference between those two opinions, or I mean, accounts of what's happening is problematic within itself. But when we talk about this issue, too, I've also noticed that a lot on the right are calling for President Trump to step in, do something, either clear up this area, but then there are some on the right that are also saying, don't touch this. Let the people see what happens in this failed utopia, if you will, and what happens when these Democratic leaders don't step in. Which side do you agree on that debate?
So I appreciate President Trump for calling this issue out. You know, our governor was asked about it at one of his press conferences, and he pretended he didn't know what was going on. He said, "That's news to me." And the only time our governor even responded to the situation on the ground was after President Trump tweeted about it. So the fact that our governor is paying more attention to Washington, D.C. than Washington State, where we live, is an indication of his problem. Look, as I said, I think President Trump is absolutely right to put the ball back in the local officials' court. The mayor owns this and the governor owns this, and it's their job to fix it. And it gives the voters of Washington State and the country a clear choice. When you're voting in November, you have to keep in mind who you're voting for and what impact that's going to have on your community. Because we've seen now in Portland and in Nashville, protesters have tried to replicate this, create autonomous zones there. And as we're seeing in Seattle, the mayor is now starting to give in to these protesters, giving them space, starting to carve things up, giving in to some of their demands. This is not how our democracy is supposed to work. And so I think from President Trump's perspective, he's going to keep highlighting that, using his Twitter platform to draw attention to the total failures of leadership that we're seeing from our mayor and our governor.
And in those other two locations as well, you bring up Nashville and Portland, there was action taken. I mean, they broke it up, and we got to the point where those autonomous zones, if you will, no longer exist. And it does show that, there is action that could be taken if someone wanted to. But it looks like in Seattle, that's not the case. So if you're a Republican, not only in Seattle, but in the rest of the country as well, is this something that you should be highlighting on the campaign trail, saying this is what Democrats want, this is what really a region without police looks like? Is that something that they should be highlighting?
Absolutely, and that's what we're doing here in Washington State. People can go to our website, WSRP.org. That's the Washington State Republican Party. But we sent out a press release. These recent events of the last week are just a culmination of the last 8 years of abject failure in Seattle. We have a socialist on our city council. We've seen homelessness skyrocket in Seattle. We've seen drug use that's just off the charts. It's out of control. 6 months ago, they had to close the county courthouse in Seattle because it wasn't safe. You couldn't even go in and pay your parking tickets or deal with a law enforcement issue because they couldn't even keep the block outside the courthouse safe. And now we're seeing what happens when you give in and give people that want to occupy a zone, you just completely give in to their demands. It's a recipe for lawlessness. And I think the average voter in Washington state or across the country, this is not what they want to see. Absolutely, they want a conversation on reform. And I think, as we saw with President Trump's executive order today, we can take common sense steps to reform policing, but we can do that while maintaining order, while protecting the rule of law.
No, I think you're right. And all you have to do is really look at the population inside that area. If it was a more popular decision, people would be rushing into that area. And the fact they're not, I think, is telling within itself of where the average American stands on this issue. Caleb, I appreciate you coming on and breaking down this bizarre situation taking place in Seattle. Thank you.